Okay, today I'm going to be reading The Humble Little Condom by, I believe, Collier, chapter 5 and 6. Okay. Medical arguments against armour and a case of caveat emptor. Doctors, debates, debauchees, and the Mrs. P's. In the 17th and 18th centuries, In the 17th and 18th centuries, science and medicine had made a few modest gains. The circulation of the blood was understood, and many of the herbal potions coming from the Orient did actually have some healing qualities. Because this was an age of war, some of the Western advances in treatment were made if only because of the many wounded soldiers who provided lots of practice. For instance, a French field surgeon decided, rightly so, that the standard practice of pouring boiling water on an open wound was not productive. Instead, he suggested a poultice of egg, oil of rose, and turpentine, which was somewhat less painful and also had soothing and antiseptic qualities. That said, this was still not a good time to be sick. There was, of course, no germ theory, so even though suturing was a positive new development in medicine, the needles used were rarely, if ever, washed. When the plague broke out in London in 1665, miasmas coming from sewers and cesspits were blamed, with few suspecting that personal cleanliness, or lack thereof, was actually the culprit. Chopping off limbs was still the most likely way to deal with crushed arms or legs, and cases of gangrene, and doctors still thought of horn of a unicorn. Doctors still thought the horn of a unicorn, where they found this necessary ingredient is a bit of a mystery, was an important healing agent, along with spiders' webs and powders made from the skulls of criminals. Of course, there was the miraculous new drug also from China. Opium at least helped to make the pain go away, even if it did not cure any ills. Cum Hastis. So, in an era of medical history when doctors were likely to answer the call to heal with a jolly good bleeding, when the notion of washing one's hands prior to moving from sickbed to childbed was not a consideration, and when the barbers and quacks, whose credentials do not appear to be much different from real doctors, practiced medicine freely, and the average woman could hope to live to the ripe old age of 40. It is perhaps surprising that a handful of influential physicians spent a great deal of time and effort to publicly denounce the humble little condom. But they did just that. In 1717, the physician, sometimes referred to as England's first dermatologist, and famous even in his own time as a surgeon, medical theorist, and author, Daniel Turner, ranted against their increasing popularity. He condemned all use of the condom as the best, if not the only, preservative our libertines have found out at present, and yet, by reason of its blunting the sensation, I have heard some of them acknowledge that they had often chose to risk a clap rather than engage Cum Hastis six like Paetus with spears thus sheathed. Turner's contempt for the preservative was based on medical rather than moral grounds, and likely stemmed from his work with syphilis patients. The idea that a little piece of cloth or gut offered full immunity and protection from such an awful disease was, according to Turner, completely ridiculous. This is a notion that would haunt the little device many centuries later. Turner's diatribe against the condom may be logical in some ways, but it is difficult to understand just why he felt compelled to mention its numbing qualities. Since this is unrelated to any medical concerns, perhaps he was worried about the blunting of sensation, believing that men would be seduced by the idea that it was an easy way to prevent disease, only to abandon it at the last minute because a spear thus sheathed could ruin the experience. Jean Astruc, a French physician and contemporary of Turner's, and one of French King Louis the 15th personal physicians, was an admirer of the English doctor's work on syphilis and another anti-condomite. In fact, Astruc was so impressed with Turner's writings condemning the condom that he wrote his own treatise, citing the other physician as the authority on the subject, and quoting from that source. Astruc's critique of the little bag made of fine seamless animal bladders poked fun at the Englishmen who foolishly used this objectionable little device, falsely believing it would keep them safe from their own debauched behaviors. Well known in France for his own work on syphilis, it seems that Astruc was not aware of the fact, or was unwilling to admit, that the condom was as popular in France as it was in England. In 1736, he wrote, I hear from the lowest debauchees who chase without restraint after the love of prostitutes that there are recently employed in England skins made from soft and seamless hides in the shape of a sheath and called condoms in English, with which those about to have intercourse wrap their penis as in a coat of mail in order to render themselves safe in the dangers of an ever doubtful battle. They claim, I suppose, that thus mailed and with spears sheathed in this way, they can undergo with impunity the chances of promiscuous intercourse. But in truth, they are greatly mistaken. They ought to arm their penises with oak, guarded with a triple plate of brass, instead of trusting to a thin bladder, who are fond of committing a part so capable of receiving infection to the filthy gulp of a harlot. Surely it is far better to live chastely, or to partake the pleasures of venery with permission and safety, than to make use of so filthy and nasty an invention. Astruc's acibically witty comments are proof that by the 18th century the French were convinced that the sheath had been invented by the English. In fact, by the early 1700s, the French routinely referred to it as the Anglaise de Rencote, Redingotes de Anglaise, and the Redingotes de Angleterre. the English raincoat, or la capote anglaise, the English cape. Curiously, the English return the favor and frequently refer to theirs as the Baudruche, or the French letter, a euphemism still in use today. Although he was certainly out of touch with the French sexual mores of the day, Ostruc does address one of the genuine problems with the condoms of old and not so old. Besides a complete lack of understanding about germs and the need for personal hygiene, the average 18th century European might have chosen to bathe once a year or not. Condoms had to be made individually by hand and could be expensive, ranging from a few pennies to a few shillings or francs each, roughly £1 to £5 or dollars in 21st century terms. So men often reused them, especially the linen variety. Laundering their sheaths, on the other hand, was a haphazard process. Although there is no way to know just how to reuse, or might not have contributed to the actual spread of venereal disease, Struck and Turner might actually have associated the condom with contagion rather than prevention. A more likely explanation, though, is that condoms made of animal intestines were often riddled with tiny holes, rendering them useless. And even with the nice silk ribbons attached, they could fall off it if used too vigorously. Other criticisms by Europe's anti condom physicians appeared somewhat later in the century. These were not, however, concerned with the condom's connection to disease prevention. Rather, they were against the little item because of its use, frequently mentioned in 18th century literature as a birth control device. In 1750, English doctor Thomas Short blasted the nefarious practices used by wicked wretches to prevent conception from their carnal gratification. Although Short railed against all methods of birth control, the condom was apparently enough of a threat to the moral health of the nation that it always featured in his lambasts. Later in 1767, the same Dr. Short was still complaining about so many wicked arts daily used to prevent conception, and by the use of instruments to prevent conception. The law, Dr. Short felt, should make sure that the instrument maker be punished or hanged with the criminals. There can be little doubt that a medical man would be aware of the condom and that these are here being condemned. Lord Campbell would have been proud. German writer, researcher, and physician Christoph Gerthaner is the only well-known medical expert from the time to castigate the condom from both angles, as disease preventative and as birth control. He also made it clear that condoms were an English, not a German or even a French, invention, and that he considered them something only debauchees, and apparently universal pejorative for anyone using condoms would ever use. In his 1788 book, Abhandlung über die Venerealkrankheit, treatise about the venereal disease, Cortana, who had also been influenced by Ostruc's work, described the methods the dreadful debauchees used to protect themselves. It is necessary, in the meanwhile, that I cite once more one of these means, because today it is considered a current custom and considered infallible by the debauchees who go to excess. On this occasion, I proved, as I have proved in other passages in this work, how difficult it is to speak on the subject which can be of interest to the human race and at the same time guard against offending modesty. The German language appears too chaste to furnish decent words on subjects so shameful. Meanwhile, the matter is too important to allow it to pass in silence. I wish to speak of the fish membranes which serve to protect the man's member during copulation. This shameful invention, which suppresses and annihilates completely the only natural end of cohabitation, namely procreation, comes from England, where these instruments were used for the first time under the debauched reign of Charles II. Even today, they bear the name of their inventor. They diminish pleasure and annihilate the natural end of cohabitation. Finally, they are insufficient to assure immunity, for the lest whole will permit contagion. And again, it may happen that during coitus the membrane may tear by a strong strain. Guillotine pretty much covers it all. The incorrect history of the condom, its origins so impure that the chaste German language just did not offer the vocabulary to describe the evils of the membrane, and his apparent assumptions or personal experiences about how they diminish pleasure. Another universal belief among the anti condom medical experts. In spite of his hatred of the device, the German doctor was an avid traveler and inadvertently helped to chronicle its widespread use and availability throughout Europe. He reported seeing them peddled in cities, in open air markets, taverns, and other retail outlets in Russia, England, his native Germany, and France. More confirmation of their incredible popularity. Like his English counterpart, Dr. Short, Guillotine was also shocked and amazed that the police in Moscow, St. Petersburg, Paris, London, and Berlin did not step in to arrest the condom peddlers in order to end the obscene open market approach to condom sales. The negligence of the police who do not seek to prevent the sale of an invention so shameful and so detrimental to repopulation is in truth inconceivable. By the 18th century, the condom had inspired a diverse group of men of letters, physicians, and even the clergy to express their opinions of the little device. These, however, were the opinions of an elite few of men who considered themselves experts in not only human health, specifically syphilis, but in human behavior. What they failed to recognize or admit was that public opinion and practice was what drove the manufacture, sale, and use of condoms all over the Western world. They were not the first, and they would not be the last to make that mistake. For all the complaints and criticisms, the condom market continued to grow and thrive throughout the 18th century. But who was actually meeting the demand, producing and selling to an ever expanding market? And why would anyone decide upon such an odd profession? The simple answer is one that applied to the condom marketplace well into the 20th century. An eclectic mix of entrepreneurs, down and outs, intellectuals, eccentrics, and crooks. Prophylactic production. Animal intestines had been used as protection for centuries, if not millennia, before the classical dictionary of the vulgar tongue was first printed in London in 1783. Written by the aptly named Captain Francis Gross, the dictionary offered this learned definition: condom, the dried gut of sheep worn by men in the act of coition to prevent venereal infection, said to have been invented by one Colonel Condom. Although making a condom was not terribly difficult and had been mastered by peoples from many cultures over many centuries, it was something that had generally been done by individuals for personal use or by those who specialized in making just a few at a time for special clients. Large scale production for profit did not begin in earnest until the late 17th century. At that time, although many people continued to fabricate their own, entrepreneurs had discovered a nice little business niche, especially in the big cities of Europe. There, visiting men of wealth were likely to want protection while they savored the ready sex of the big city, and residents who could afford the prefabricated variety were unlikely to want something as primitive as homemade armour. But of the appeal for manufacturers, but of the appeal for manufacturers was that condoms would be produced in very small spaces, needing only a table or a workbench and a few basic supplies. Animal intestines or guts were cheap and readily available at any butcher shop or sausage supplier. The intestine of one sheep could make dozens of condoms, and the ribbon necessary to keep them in place could be purchased very inexpensively from any liner or haberdasher. Making linen condoms was more challenging since they required careful stitching and were expected to be longer lasting than the gut variety. Many were also treated with chemical solutions, some no more than herbal oils and water, others more caustic, such as lye based concoctions, intended as extra protection from disease, but some of which also acted accidentally as spermicide. Although linen condoms were available through to the end of the 18th century because they were more expensive to produce and to purchase and not as comfortable as gut, they had lost favor by the 1800s. The method of production for making gut condoms remained the same for about 300 years, well into the 20th century. The intestinal material, caeca, 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 was soaked in water for several hours, then macerated in a weak alkaline lye solution, which was changed every 12 hours. This was done over a 1 to 2 day period. Then the intestinal material was carefully scraped to remove the mucous membrane using primitive metal instruments like cheap kitchen knives and long iron nails. The chemicals and scraping left just the peritoneal and muscular coat of the intestine, which was exposed to the vapor of burning brimstone. A pot of sulfur placed over an open flame until it let off a sulfuric steam that helped soften the gut. Finally, the softened sheet of what was left of the original intestine was washed in lye soap and water. Oblong-shaped pieces of the gut were cut out with large primitive shears. Then small holes were cut or punched around the top edges. If the final consumer, if the final consumer were lucky, the manufacturer might examine the pieces for tiny holes, a very rare occurrence, judging by a French physician's note in 1770. He complained that his redigotes and glace were riddled with a whole lot of pores. Finally, the still wet strip was bordered at the open end with a ribbonade, ready for sale. Baudruches fines, superfines, superfines, good, better, best. By the early part of the 18th century, the condom's tremendous popularity had led to a demand for better, more comfortable models. Savvy entrepreneurs responded by diversifying their goods, offering a variety of qualities and sizes, living up to their reputation as the inventors of the sheath. English manufacturers led the way in the effort to meet consumer demand, and they added a little extra panache by giving them fancy French names like Baudruches fines, superfines, and superfines. Popular euphemisms for about 200 years. Even though manufacturers worked hard to produce a finer condom, the materials used and the methods of curing did not change. Intestines of sheep, cows, or lambs were prepared in the same manner as the one size fits all model, but instead of just an oblong sack with a ribbon at the top, the fines were shaped and made smoother by being placed over oiled molds. These glass penis shaped casts were sized small, medium, and large, and were ordered from local glass blowers, men who must have had delightful senses of humor. By molding the gut instead of a man tying a berimbund bag over his yard, the 18th century man's favorite reference to his penis, the better quality condom was nicely tailored and offered an improved fit. Better yet, there were the Baudruches superfines, which were made in the same manner as the Baudruches fines, but the superfines were rubbed with oil scented with essences of flowers and spices, partly an effort to overcome the unpleasant smells that accompanied sex in a population that bathed very rarely, partly to make the chemically treated intestinal walls smell a bit less earthy, then rubbed with smooth glass to polish them. And finally, there were the ultimate Baudruches superfines doubles, which were actually two guts placed over one another while still moist, so that the two insides adhere together. Although these were the piece de resistance of all condoms, and doubling up on the carefully prepared fabric was intended to offer the ultimate protection, the doubles were actually not as popular as their lesser counterparts because they deadened sensation in a big way. Interestingly so, interestingly, no matter the quality, price, or size, each condom was trimmed to a standard 7 or 8-inch length, and of course, they all had pretty silk ribbons. Pink, scarlet, and blue were the favorite colors. Fitted around the top, because no matter how nicely they were molded, even the fanciest Baudruche still would not stay on without its little bow. The problem with even the highest quality gut condoms, though, was that no matter how much brimstoning and scented oils were employed, the material could rub tender parts the wrong way, and if the skins were not properly rinsed and soaked repeatedly in fresh water to remove all the chemicals, they could leave nasty burns and cause vaginal infections. With linen condoms, the seams could cause lesions, but for those who wanted the best of both worlds, sex and safety, condoms, Baudruches, armour, schist, and redingotes anglaises were worth the impediments. Their popularity grew throughout the ensuing centuries. The Mrs. P's and London's Machine Wars. Throughout Europe, condoms were bought and sold in a variety of locations, including pubs, barber shops, chemist shops, open air markets, by street vendors, and at the theatre, as evidenced by the prose of the time. London's St. James's Park, Spring Garden, Bow Street, and the Pall Mall were known to be major outlets for outdoor condom sales. Men and women peddled them out of doors, from the baskets and bags they carried on their backs and on top of their heads, from push carts, or simply from their pockets. This ragtag sales force was made up of out of work actors, down and out prostitutes, unsuccessful con men, as well as legitimate hawkers who saw a chance to diversify. They could be found selling their wares in all weathers at all hours, and were such a common sight that condom sales became part of the local landscape. And the beauty of the business was that it was not as weather dependent as others like the fresh vegetable or the fruit market. In fact, the market really boomed during the winter, with most people housebound and looking for indoor entertainment. There were even complaints about some of the more aggressive condom salespeople who, when business was slow, were not shy about targeting men they thought looked like potential customers. Because of their high visibility, there was okay. Because of their high visibility, there was a move to tax condom salespeople as legitimate peddlers. But the authorities dropped the idea because they did not want to be associated with the little item. Then the conservative lawmakers were fearful that by taxing this kind of business, they would be legitimatizing it, and it would be perceived by the public as putting a stamp of approval on illicit sex. For more than 150 years, the issue of whether condom enterprise was a legitimate business or not came up repeatedly in Europe and later in the United States. It is doubtful anyone in the industry was troubled by lack of good standing. However, it simply meant greater profits, no strings attached. Do as Sage SLN is wont to do for greater safety. Put on too, with red bag pendant on your bars below. Advice from a condom manufacturer. London's condom wars. Although most hawkers of condoms were pretty colorful, none could match the dynamic. and certainly most public, condom purveyors in London, the feuding Mrs. P's. The London Condom Wars began in the early 18th century, fought between three of the leading manufacturers of the little device, with an advertising blitz worthy of any modern American political campaign. Mrs. Mary Perkins and the two Mrs. Phillipses began a public feud over who sold the best condoms. The saga began in 1731 with the first Mrs. Phillips, who started her retail business selling her homemade machines. Yet another euphemism made popular in 18th century London. In two of that city's most famous and infamous pubs, both popular watering holes since the time of the Stuarts. This first Mrs. P divided her time between the rumor and the grape and the rose, peddling her wares to their colorful patrons, including London's Freemasons, who conducted their secret meetings at these hostelries throughout the 17th and 18th centuries. Mrs. Phillips quickly became one of the most successful condom producers in England, perhaps even on the continent, and opened her own wholesale/retail outlet where a team of women produced all sorts of machines in a small room at the back of her shop. She did so well, making so much money selling condoms, not only to individuals and local businesses, but also to customers all over Europe, that Mrs. Phillips decided to cash in on her success and retire. In 1766, she sold her business to Mrs. Mary Perkins. By then, the first Mrs. P had been producing condoms at the sign of the Green Canister on Half Moon Street for more than 35 years. After 10 years of peaceful retirement away from the daily grind of condom production and sales, Mrs. Phillips re emerged, claiming she had heard a rumor about Mrs. Perkins. She said she had been told that this lady was not keeping to her high standards of manufacture. Mrs. Phillips was so concerned about the bad news that she decided to go back to work. She opened a new condom business located at the Orange Court at the sign of the Golden Fan and Rising Sun near Leicester Fields. Determined to regain her original market and to get Mrs. Perkins' shoddy goods off the shelves, Mrs. Phillips designed an admirable marketing blitz. She hired young men to hand out her handbills in crowded public streets and to distribute them to the most likely secondary retail outlets. The advertisements offered a range of skins and bladders to apothecaries, chemists, druggists, etc. They also boasted about Mrs. Phillips's select and diverse clientele, which she claimed included ambassadors, foreigners, gentlemen, and captains of ships, etc., who took advantage of the best deal going abroad with any quality of the best goods in England on the shortest notice at and at lowest price. Mrs. Phillips was proud of the fact that she filled orders to be shipped to France, Spain, Portugal, Italy, and other foreign places. But the best part of her marketing strategy was her actors who wandered the streets singing her very own jingle, extolling the virtues of her fine goods. To guard yourself from shame or fear, Fooleries to Venus, hasten here. None in our wares are found the flaw. Self-preservation's nature's law. It was the wording of the returning Mrs. Phillips's advertisements, publicly criticizing the quality of Mrs. Perkins's machines, that really started the war. Mrs. Phillips stated in her sales campaign that she was forced to return to business because she had been prevailed upon by her friends to reassume the same again upon representations that, since her declining, they cannot procure any goods comparable to those she used to vend. The story became complicated when a second Mrs. Phillips materialized and declared in circulars that the first Mrs. Phillips was dead. The second Mrs. P turned out to be none other than Mrs. Perkins, angry over not just Mrs. Phillips reappearing and competing for her business, but because of the direct knock at the quality of her goods. The second Mrs. Phillips, aka Mrs. Perkins, even put out her own handbills proclaiming some evil-minded person has given out handbills that the machine warehouse, the Green Canister, in Half Moon Street in the Strand, is removed. It is without foundation and only to prejudice me, this being the old original shop, still continued by the successor of the late Mrs. Phillips, where gentlemen's orders shall be punctually observed in the best manner as usual. Mrs. Perkins, or the second Mrs. Phillips, went so far as to steal the first Mrs. Phillips's jingle, hiring her own troubadours to sing it while they distributed handbills, advertising her wares, which included not only machines but snuff, soap, essences, and ladies' black sticking plaster. The plaster was a popular item with women who cut out cute little hearts and stars to stick over small scars on their faces, a common and unfortunate result of smallpox. Mrs. Perkins was far more diversified than the first Mrs. Phillips, but that lady had a nationwide, even European wide, wholesale business in machine sales. So, presumably, although the final outcome of this public feud is unknown, the two Mrs. P's must have ended their battle and got on with the business of producing and selling condoms. Certainly, whatever happened at the close of the condom wars, few Londoners of the time would not have known about these ladies and their dueling machines. Remember to recycle. Although not directly involved in London's condom wars, perhaps the most colorful women who sold the little device were those who also saw treasures in other people's trash. Mrs. Jenny, for instance, was most famous for her excellent tavern, where she offered extra services to gentlemen in her upstairs rooms. She was also well known for her ample supply of good quality condoms, many of which were surprisingly affordable. Unbeknownst to her customers, Mrs. Jenny's staff were very good about collecting them after they had been discarded, so that she could recycle them, which is why they were so cheap. Unfortunately for the unsuspecting users of the slightly used machines, she did launder them before reuse. And then there was Mrs. Jenkins, a madame who owned a brothel known to Londoners and visitors alike for catering to customers with kinky tastes. Mrs. Jenkins's girls were especially adept at the practice of flagellation, which was 18th century England's favorite sadomasochistic sexual ritual. She also ran an excellent side trade in the buying, washing, and reselling of slightly used Baudruches. Other women purveyors of condoms in London, like Mother Lewis, seem to have stayed away from the heated battles and the peculiar dealings of some of their fellow vendors, preferring to sell their wares in pubs and taverns. There was also yet another Mrs. Phillips, with the interesting first name Khan, who at least deserved the award for having been in the condom business the longest. She was still selling them from her shop on Bedford Street in the 1760s and had opened her business in 1701. Elsewhere in Europe, business was also brisk, though less colorful than the battling Mrs. Phillips's. Merchant Matthias van Mordecai Cohen, one of Amsterdam's better known 18th century purveyors, did a brisk business in condoms, which he made himself from lamb's bladders and silk ribbons. The Russians, Germans, French, Swiss, and many others were also producing a variety of condoms for their own local markets, unmolested by taxes, legal restraints, customs, or duties. Rags, nuts, and yards. Condom salespeople may have inadvertently been given a marketing freebie from an odd source. Though not a manufacturer or a salesman, in 1708 Englishman John Martin did get some attention for his part in promoting their use. A self proclaimed scientific expert, more accurately referred to by historians as a quack, Martin actually promoted condom use as a cure for syphilis, advertising his curative in London newspapers. Mr. Martin was not selling a cure all condom, however. His advertisements claimed that he possessed a secret formula, a liquid the customer was supposed to dip his rag into, a sure cure for the problem, or better yet, it was best used prior to catching a disease in the first place. In his advertisement for the liquid solution, Martin included his own sage advice about just how to get the most out of his formula. Lint or linen rags be divers times wet in it and dried in the shade of a sufficient bigness to involve the glands or nut of the man's yard, or to cover the inner parts of the privity of the woman, and applied and kept on for a while before engagement, will so harden the members, dry up the superfluous moistness, and resist putrefaction, as that no one that uses them shall ever be afflicted with the pox. There are no records as to how well the formula sold, but Martin certainly had a way with words, and he was not alone in his colorful language describing condoms, condom use, and the excellent reasons for employing them. Besides the faceless Freemasons, Mr. Jenkins's odd clients, besides the faceless Freemasons, Mr. Jenkins's odd clients and ambassadors, foreigners, gentlemen, and captains of ships, some of history's most famous and infamous men truly loved their machines, armour, and redingotes en église. Chapter 6. The most famous and infamous users of all, the Celebrity Overcoat. By this machine secure, the willing maid can taste love's joys, nor is she more afraid. Her swelling belly should, or squalling brat, betray the luscious pastime she has been at. The Machine, 1714. The 18th century brought forth some of the most profound political and philosophical changes so far experienced in Western history. New nations were formed, and the first modern democracies were born. Mozart and Handel composed some of the most beautiful, complex music heretofore heard, and Captain Cook discovered the fantastic Pacific Islands. But while Voltaire and Rousseau argued over lofty issues like education, democracy, and religion, Hume, Paine, and Bentham explored the concepts that would eventually give shape and form to the coming cultural explorations and conflicts. Other famous and infamous men of the Enlightenment were exploring somewhat earthier topics. In fact, the Enlightenment's most exalted lovers held their humble little condoms in very high regard. In their letters, diaries, and memoirs, these men sang the praises of their armour machines and redingotes anglaises, and all spoke of their little sheaths with affection. One of these men is often referred to as the world's greatest lover, claiming to have come from a minor aristocratic family. He could boast a great grandfather who had sailed with Christopher Columbus. Giacomo Girolamo Casanova was actually the son of two Venetian actors from whom he probably inherited his larger than life presence. Casanova lived a checkered but very colorful existence, full of misadventure, free sex, multiple prison stays, and lots of near misses. He was a gambler with women and in business, which made him a very rich and sometimes a very poor man. When he was in the money, he frequently socialized with some of the most eminent leaders of his time, and his prowess as a lover became so well known that modern English uses his name as a synonym for sexual rogue. But Casanova displayed an unusually practical side. For a man who slept with women all over Europe, he used condoms. His principal reason for doing so was to avoid the complications likely when sleeping with other men's wives, but it was mostly to prevent infection. In his History de ma vie, History of My Life, written around 1789, Casanova mentions his redinogotes, redingotes anglelettre, or English raincoats. In spite of the fact that he had earned his letters in canon and civil law at the University of Padua, he was obviously unaware that a fellow Italian had popularized the early modern Western condom. Like so many other Europeans, Casanova thought they had originated in England, calling them the little preventative bag invented by the English to save the fair sex from anxiety. He described his as a little coat of very fine and transparent skin, 8 inches long and closed at one end. with a narrow pink ribbon slotted through the open end, and an overcoat that puts one's mind at rest. Wonderful preventative against an accident, which might lead to frightful repentance. Casanova also used his bag as a part of foreplay, innocently requesting his partner's assistance in putting it on. He even invented the party trick of entertaining ladies by blowing up his raincoats like balloons, which was also a good way to ensure they did not have any tiny holes in them. Perhaps surprisingly, he was the first to brag about how women fell all over themselves as they sought his sexual favors, and how easily he was able to get them to bed. One of Casanova's more colorful condom experiences took place in a brothel. On this presumably rare visit to a prostitute, he had forgotten his overcoat. When he asked the madame for one, she tried to sell him an inferior variety that was far too coarse for his aristocratic member, and he demanded better quality. The madame offered to sell him a dozen of her finest, but only a dozen because she had to buy them that way and did not want to break up the set. Presumably, this French madame, like many of her English counterparts, did a brisk side business in selling condoms in quantity. Feeling he was being fleeced, Casanova made the best of the situation by requesting his villageois help him prick just which of the overpriced condoms he should wear. She came back with the pack. I put myself in the right position and ordered her to choose me one that fitted well. Sulkily, she began examining and measuring. And this one doesn't fit well. I told her, try another, another, and another, and suddenly I splashed her well and truly. Not all of Casanova's willing lovers appreciated his raincoats, however. One of them told him she preferred him au naturel, enjoying his petit personnage, more without the nasty, disgusting, and scandalous covering. She went on to condemn the condom as something meant only for the boring and overcautious. Love devised these little overcoats, but love in alliance with caution, and that's a dull kind of alliance, fit only for gloomy politics. But in spite of his obvious respect for the little item, Casanova did record that there were times when he shut myself up in a piece of dead skin in order to prove that I am perfectly alive, and found it very unsatisfying. By far the most entertaining account of his experiences with condoms took place while he was having an affair with a French nun while snooping through her thighs. Casanova was amazed to discover a box of sheath in her secretary. Curious to see whether she would miss them, he quietly put the box into his pocket and quickly penned a poem to put in its place. As Casanova and his lover were going to bed, she excused herself and went to her secretary to get her box. Instead of the condoms, Casanova's lover found the poem he had left in their place. Children of friendship, ministers of grief, I am love. Tremble and respect the thief. And you, God's wife, shrink not from the motherhood. If you conceive, you will claim fatherhood. But if you will your fruits to me deny, speak up. I'll unman myself to comply. Quickly penning a reply that might leave the reader of the verse wondering why this lady had become a nun, she responded in kind. When an angel fucks me, I've no doubts that nature's author is my only spouse. But to keep his line above suspicion, love must return my sheath without objection, only as I'm subject to his holy will. May my friend fuck me fearless, as he will. Casanova gave in, returned the box, donned a little sheath, and proceeded to unman himself. He describes how, after an hour, his lover removed his sheath to gaze upon his quintessence therein. Casanova's lewd story adds an interesting footnote to the history of the condom. It proves that women of the 18th century were not just their primary manufacturers and purveyors, they also purchased them. And the fact that a nun slept with the world's most famous lover, the humble little condom cannot be blamed or credited. That the world is overrun with vice cannot be denied, but vice, however predominant, has not yet gained an unlimited dominion. That the world is overrun with vice cannot be denied, but vice, however predominant, has not yet gained an unlimited dominion. Samuel Johnson in his Rambler Essays, 1751. Perhaps not as universally recognized as Casanova, another 18th century condom chronicler is still a household name in England, famed in British history as a real ladies' man, or, or at the very least, a man with a penchant for having sex out of doors. James Boswell was a Scottish lawyer and writer, but is best known as the biographer and dear friend of Samuel Johnson. A prolific author himself, Dr. Johnson is second only to Shakespeare as the most quoted writer in history, and he is the father of the modern dictionary. Perhaps most significant in the story of Boswell is that Dr. Johnson was also renowned throughout Europe as a moral philosopher, a man who sought to smite vice at every turn. In spite of his friend's influence, however, Boswell was anything but anti vice or sexually conservative. Quite the opposite. He had little regard for public or private morality. It is a historical irony, in fact, that the friend and biographer of a man distinguished in history for his righteous homilies and proclamations on the evils of vice was himself a sexual gladiator. James Boswell did not begin his amorous adventures at the condom zealot. He noted in his personal journal that his first experience wearing one was not much fun. He had picked up a teenage prostitute in St. James's Park, and for the first time did I engage in amour, which I found but a dull satisfaction. In spite of this lack of enthusiasm for his amour, a few weeks after that first engagement, he tried using it again. Boswell is also one of those who believed in getting the most for his money, wearing the same armor over and over again, and strolled into the park and took the first whore I met, whom without many words copulated with free from danger, being safely sheathed. She was ugly and lean, and her breath smelt of spirits. When it was done, she slunk off. I had a low opinion of this gross practice, and resolved to do it no more. This time, his complaint was about having anonymous sex with a skinny stranger, not about using a condom. But Boswell was a man with a very active libido, and he broke his vow to himself to do it no more, at the same time proving his renewed dedication to the use of armour. At the bottom of Haymarket, I picked up a strong, jolly young damsel, and taking her under the arm, I conducted her to Westminster Bridge, and there in armour complete did engage her upon this noble edifice. The whim of doing it there, with the Thames rolling below, was amusement to me much. He no doubt enjoyed the extra added excitement of the possibility of being caught while engaging out of doors, while all of London was in the streets that night, celebrating the birthday of King George III. There were times when the promise of exciting sex overcame Boswell's caution. Only a few days after the King's celebration, he recorded in his journal his next exploit. I picked up a fresh, agreeable girl named Alice Gibbs. We went down a lane to a snug place, and I took out my armour, but she begged that I might not put it on, as the sport was much pleasanter without it, and as she was quite safe. I was so rash as to trust her, and had a very agreeable congress. At least Boswell suffered from a fit of worry over what he might have picked up, and his remorse did the trick. She was back in his armor within a week, this time before engaging in more fresco sex. He took a moment to rinse it off in a canal, probably because wet gut fits better than dry, rather than because of a genuine concern over cleanliness. No voice save that of the passions can conduct you to happiness. The Marquise de Sade. The most infamous condom user in history has to be the Marquise de Sade, who, like his slightly more conventional 18th century Italian counterpart, was so well known in his own time for his sexual exploits. His name has its own special place in the English language. Unlike that of Casanova's, though, the Marquise's name has a sinister air to it, as a reference to cruel or natural sex, sadism, sadist, or sadistic. Donatien Alphonse François de Sade, Donatien Alphonse François de Sade was from an aristocratic French family. However, in spite of his social status and his reputation as the worst of sexual libertines, he somehow managed to survive the French Revolution and the guillotine. Deschade's entire life was devoted to his sexual exploits and to writing about them. He used his personal experiences and those of others, real and imagined, as the basis of his writings. Justine, the Marquise's most famous and most controversial book, put him on the map as a novelist and a pornographer. But it is in his book La philosophie dans les boudoirs, The Philosophy in the Bedroom, circa 1795, where Deschades discussed his favorite methods of birth control. One of those was the condom, or, as he referred to it, un petit sac de peau de Venise, a little sack of the skin of Venice. As the characters in his philosophy discuss the various methods for practicing safe sex, the gentleman patiently explains to the lady, others oblige their fuckers to make use of a little sack of Venetian skin, in the vulgate called a condom, which the semen fills and where it is prevented from flowing farther. The term Venetian skin refers to where the little sacks he favored were manufactured. Venetian makers were known to make a superior condom, and Deschades used only the best. For his literary efforts and exploits, the Marquis de Sade was both loved and despised by his contemporaries. He is remembered today as not only a prolific writer of pornography, but also for his passion for all things kinky. Eventually, though, his writings about sexual excess, as well as his outrageous personal habits, landed him in a French prison, accused of crimes against nature. In many ways, the condom was in its heyday in the 17th and 18th centuries, when it was not only commonly used, but was actually de rigueur among the elite. Condom makers tried to diversify and produce a variety of sizes and qualities. Women spoke up regarding their own preferences on or off, and during a time in history when they had very few options as far as supporting themselves, some women found producing and selling armour, sheaths, and machines an excellent way to make a living. On the flip side, it was women who suffered the gravest consequences from dirty or failed condoms and experienced the greatest discomfort from the poorly made variety. But that is the European Baudruche. What about the New World? When did the condom make its way to America? Saucy Love, Pullbacks, and The Good Doctor, Sex in the New World. A fair virgin longing to be sped and meet her lover in a nuptial bed, decked in rich ornaments to advance her state and excellence, being most fortunate when most enjoyed. Thomas Morton's Vision of America, 1625. In 1625, the Puritans of Plymouth Colony were shocked when the English barrister and adventurer Thomas Morton took over a plantation just down the road from the virtuous colonists. The friction was hardly surpassing considering Morton's philosophy. He advocated free love for men and women, and he envisioned his plantation as an oasis of sexual self expression and exploration. He also consorted openly with the local natives, dancing and frisking together. Morton's sexually charged colony within a colony, aptly named Merrymount, so offended the Puritans that in 1628 they sent Captain Miles Standish to arrest him. Morton managed to avoid Standish, but eventually they forcibly deported him back to England after Puritan leaders accused Morton and his followers of pouring themselves into all profaneness and participating in unclean acts. So determined to live the unfettered lifestyle he envisioned possible in the New World, after only a short stay in England, Morton foolishly returned to his merry mount. He was no more welcome the second time around. Upon arrival, the Puritans promptly threw him in prison, where he was so badly treated that he died soon after. Morton's case was a precautionary tale for those from the old world who believed they could arrive on the shores of Massachusetts and live their lives as they pleased. The Puritans were a determined group who were sure that they could keep their colony moral if they made all sexual acts they considered unclean illegal. Adultery was punishable by death and was defined as a man having sex with a married woman. And their buggery laws declared masturbation and oral sex, because they wasted the seed, crimes against God. But no matter how hard those early settlers tried to control other people's sex lives, as the colonies expanded and matured, sexual beliefs and behaviors were as varied as the population itself, reflecting the European norms from which they derived. In fact, the late colonial period was a pretty sexy one, where these were the folks who encouraged premarital sex with the practice of bundling, where a couple contemplating betrothal was allowed to sleep in the same bed with just a blanket or board between them. Religious colonials were also quite literal in discussing the duties of a wife to supply her husband with ample sex, as the conjugal relation came from the natural inclinations of men, of which himself, meaning God, is the author. A noise affrighted him and made him run away, and he then carried away in haste her petticoat instead of his breeches. A noise affrighted him and made him run away, and he then carried away in haste her petticoat instead of his breeches. Evidence of lurid behaviors and normal sex activity were are peppered throughout colonial and revolutionary literature. Parents wrote to sons away from home, warning them against the wanton behaviors of young people, fearful of the consequences of unprotected sex. And it is the concerns themselves that document the steady loosening of moral codes in the late colonial period, especially obvious in the growing cities. Even Harvard University was the target of fear and scorn by parents worried about their children's sexual purity. A father preparing to send his son off to that hallowed institution as early as 1672 told the boy to be wary of youthful lusts, speculative wantonness, and secret filthiness. Do not waste your precious time by love of any filthy lust. Strong language for a post Puritan. Interestingly, even in Governor Bradford's History of the Plymouth Colony, there are snippets from private letters and journals that indicate Americans were a fairly excitable bunch and that they practiced birth control. Like the women of earlier cultures and of early modern Europe, married women generally took responsibility for it, and they used a variety of methods to prevent contraception or to interfere with a pregnancy. Some of these practices arrived with the Europeans, and some were learned from the native peoples, who utilized many of the same herbal contraceptive remedies that would have been recognizable to the ancients. Men were also involved, though if Governor Bradford's accounts are anything to go by, they were more concerned about covering up their affairs with married women or with young servants than about taking responsibility when they practiced birth control. Rogering Love Lard spent clapped manual uncleanliness, giving a flourish. taking about, saucy love, mowing, powerful, flourish, girling of it, fuddling, flapper, enveloped, topped, foxters. The language of love in 18th century America. Although the social constraints of the early colonial period had relaxed by the time the colonists began their struggle to be free of British control, the Revolutionary period has been represented historically as a sexually constrained one. In fact, although they may have been the recipients of the founding fathers' high minded ideals for nation building, many Americans lived pretty lusty lifestyles. At dusts and kick-ups, young men and women frolicked, sometimes with no chaperones. During the American Revolution, revolutionary soldiers were welcomed to join in, especially if they were of the same social status as the host and other guests. When he was able to get a girl alone, and by all accounts, many young women were just as eager to frolic as the young men, the smart soldier, especially one who came from a nearby town or village, made attempts to prevent getting a girl pregnant. Those men who had been raised on farms or who worked as butchers would have known what their forebears had understood. The intestines of a cow, goat, or sheep could be fashioned into a useful device when they could get hold of a length of gut. Sailors, on the other hand, had the greatest access to pre made condoms imported from Europe if they had the funds. Smart sailors could fill their sea chests with contraband condoms, hidden from the tax collector's view, and would have made a tidy sum selling to tavern owners and fellow sailors. Journals and other documents from the Revolutionary period, though, are not forthcoming or specific about condom use. There are few asides detailing the kind of activities noted in European sources, and judging by the high rate of shotgun marriages at the time, protection was either not as popular or as well understood as in Europe, or there were lots of failures. Um, but that would change during the 2 or 3 decades following the Revolution, when the secretive condom emerged, assuming its permanent place in American history. Appropriately, it is in the new nation's first 2 capitals that the humble little condom began to come out of the closet. The doctor, the guillotine, and the condom. In post revolutionary Philadelphia, illicit sex was not just for the red light districts. Casual sexual encounters and adultery were commonplace among Philadelphians of all social classes. It was probably because of its social and sexual freedoms that the nation's first capital became home to the condom's first and biggest retail market. By the late 1700s, the city of brotherly love had become a retreat for a thriving French emigre community. Many of the expatriates, having escaped Robespierre and his infamous guillotine. One of the most interesting and colorful of these was Médéric Louis Moreau de Saint Mary, a French lawyer born in the West Indies. When Saint Mary left the islands for Paris in the 1760s, he joined the French king's gendarmerie and eventually studied law. He even claimed to have been the one to have rediscovered and restored Christopher Columbus's tomb. When St. Marie decided in the early 1790s to tour his native Santo Domingo, he found that French politics had affected the islands, and it was not safe for someone who had once worked for the king to go to the French Caribbean. Rather than cancel his plans to travel, he decided to take an extended tour of the new American nation instead. When he arrived in America's first capital, St. Mary liked the thriving and rowdy city. He wrote enthusiastically about seeing President George Washington open the first Congress and was generally fascinated by the new American nation. He enjoyed the experience so much he decided to stay. In order to support himself, in 1794, St. Marie opened a bookshop on Front and Walnut Streets where he sold minute books, trendy little volumes like Poor Richard's Almanac, and brainier French works like Voltaire. However, the lawyer recognized the possibility of a much more lucrative market in the bawdy capital. Along with the mostly French books he sold to his fellow emigres, St. Marie imported fine condoms from Paris and did a thriving business selling the little items to both Frenchmen and Americans. When he described how his business grew beyond selling just books, St. Marie recorded it this way in his diary. I did not wish to deprive my business of a profitable item, the lack of which in hot climates would not, I think, be without danger. Consequently, when my old colleague and friend, Barrister Genji, a refugee from Cape Francois in Baltimore, who had a wide knowledge of medical supplies, offered me a stock of certain small contrivances in ingenious things said to have been suggested by the stork, I agreed. I wish to say that I carried a complete assortment of them for 4 years, and while they were primarily intended for the use of French colonialists, they were in great demand among Americans, in spite of the false shame so prevalent among the latter. Thus, the use of this medium on the vast American continent dates from this time. People of San Domingo, as well as from other colonies, had frequent recourse for our stock. Although venereal disease was epidemic in Philadelphia at the time, St. Mary's French customers purchased their Baudruches as much for birth control as for disease prevention. The demand was so great he had a hard time keeping his shelves filled. This was due in part to the fact that, though St. Mary's business was a legitimate one, his importation practices were not quite as above board. He paid ship's captains to smuggle his condoms in their personal lockers, avoiding the prying eyes of customer agents and the heavy tariff the little items carried. This practice could slow down delivery. He was also convinced that only the French could make a truly fine rouge, and he refused to set up a manufacturing business to produce his own. This business also gave St. Mary's a bird's eye view of Philadelphian society. The Frenchman was keenly aware of the social interactions among the city's inhabitants. In spite of his excellent sales, he was very cynical about his American customers' use of the condom, as he mentioned in his diary. He felt they were hypocritical in the way they indulged. Well known, wealthy, and well respected customers appeared very upright and conservative in public, yet they surreptitiously bought and used condoms in order to protect themselves while having adulterous affairs and making extensive use of the many prostitutes in the city. American men had never been so interested in reading before. St. Mary preferred the honest dalliances of the French upper class. He also noted with some disgust the general ignorance of American women regarding issues of sexuality, perhaps explaining why there is no documentation of women buying or selling condoms, unlike their European counterparts during this period. This general ignorance about sex remained a sad fact for American women well into the 20th century. Unfortunately, though, St. Mary was a well respected merchant and a member of the Philadelphia Philosophical Society, where he counted among his friends and associates men like Talleyrand and French consul Lesseps, father of the builder of the Suez Canal. St. Mary was not a very good businessman. It was probably due then to poor business acumen rather than poor sales, that in 1797 he decided to sell his business and return to France, where he was embraced by Empress Josephine. Later, he was a great proponent and public advocate of the sale of Louisiana to America, assuring the French leaders that the exchange would cement American and French alliances. St. Mary's exit from Philadelphia was a great loss to the city, but not to condom sales. By then, Philadelphians could purchase protection from barbers, madams, individual peddlers, and in taverns, as well as imported Baudruches from discreet tradesmen. The second condom capital. By the 1740s, and long after the American Revolution, New York's first red light district was known as the Holy Ground, so named because the land it occupied, which was adjacent to what is today Columbia University, was owned by the Episcopal Trinity Church. Here on holy ground, tavern keepers and madams quietly offered condoms for sale. However, the device was most popular among middle and upper class men who enjoyed the easy access and inexpensive services of a huge assortment of prostitutes, and young women who enjoyed late night adventures with strangers when they visited New York. Working class men, on the other hand, rarely used protection. Like Philadelphia, the class distinction is evidenced by the terrible incident of the clap, the pox, and the fatal disorder suffered by working class New Yorkers and British soldiers during the Revolution who partook of the Holy Ground's entertainments. Naval officers were the most likely to use condoms regularly. They had the access to imports from Europe and could afford the good quality favored by European lovers, and were more worldly than the country folk, common soldiers, and sailors who flocked to the second capital. High class prostitutes did ask customers to use protection, but the poor street walkers and brothel workers had a difficult time convincing lesser clients to use protection. They could not afford condoms themselves. Although quietly available from private sources, They were expensive, the best sold for the equivalent of $5 a piece on today's market. That could easily be many months' pay for a streetwalker. That and the fact that few working class people understood the horrible possible consequences of unprotected sex, or were simply unaware of condom use, meant that protection was not taken as seriously as it was by the upper classes. However, for the working girl, using a condom would have made a lot of sense. Manhattan's debtors' prison was used not just to lock up unfortunates owing monies they could not repay. Pimps frequently locked up their girls who were unlucky enough to become pregnant. And late 18th century New York's hospitals and almshouses were full of prostitutes, debilitated and dying from the painful symptoms of the clap and the pox.